Hello, good morning to all, and welcome to today's session of Connected University. The topic we will discuss is data sharing, data platforms, and data spaces. Please keep in mind that the session is recorded and will appear on the Digital EU YouTube channel. The slides will be posted on Futurium. Also, remember to ask us questions on Slido using the code data platforms. So, what are we going to discuss today? As we sometimes hear in the news, we produce increasing amounts of data each and every day, and this opens immense opportunities to develop new services and provide benefits for all. In this context, data sharing strengthens collective knowledge, incentivizes collaboration, and allows the development of new services and products affecting nearly all aspects of our lives. However, together with these opportunities, there are also increasing risks of misuse and privacy infringements. This is why, for us, it is important to act on both fronts, incentivizing data sharing so we can harvest its benefits, while at the same time making sure that European rules and values, such as, for example, data protection, consumer protection, and competition law, are fully respected. We will hear today how we approach this from different perspectives. On one side, we build a regulatory framework defining clear rules for fair data sharing and use and reuse. And this will be presented to you by Szymon Lewandowski, a policy officer in data policy. On another side, we invest in infrastructure developments, funding common European data spaces where data holders, users, and service providers can come together to unleash the full power of data. And this is something we will hear more from Gianfranco Cecconi, representative of the Data Spaces Support Center, which has kindly joined us today to give us a touch on real life and what's happening on the ground. But we also support ongoing technological development because digital technology is something that keeps progressing, and we want to ensure that we have available the best tools, both for data management and analytics, but also for data security, data privacy, and compliance with regulations. Kim Rossi, the head of sector of data research and innovation, will provide an overview of our current research and innovation portfolio. So as you see, we have an interesting session ahead of us, and without further ado, I leave the floor to the first presentation. Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Beatrice. I'll just start sharing my presentation. Hopefully everything will work as planned. Is it okay? So, in that case, I will start the series of presentations today by outlining and explaining a bit the European policies and data, in particular the European data strategy from 2020 and the legislation which was announced within that strategy and which, well, in many cases has only just been or is being adopted now. Let me start with just an overview or just some few very generic figures on the data economy in Europe, just to basically justify why the Commission is dealing with data and why we have a separate policy on data. So in fact, as probably all of you are aware, we as a society and economy are generating huge amounts of data. And we already know that data is an asset, is a resource. So data is already being used to transform our economy, to empower our economy. It is a source of innovation for new products, new services, and as such, of course, it can help us tackle key societal challenges such as climate change, but also public health, mobility, etc. We have more and more processing power, we have more and more technologies such as artificial intelligence, and obviously at the basis of that is the data. Now, the value of the data economy, so basically the impact that the economy has on Europe, or the data has on Europe's economy is growing year by year. And here I'm just giving some basic figures. which I don't think we need to retain, but just to say that there's a certain trend, and the trend is clear. If we look at the value of the data economy in 2018, and we see the projected value of the data economy in 2025, we see an almost threefold increase. So it's really something that is worth fighting for, and this is why we need to make sure that we have all framework, let's say, conditions in place in Europe to make sure that data delivers, that all these benefits for society and economy are actually realized. And there's also another interesting phenomenon that we are witnessing is that whereas we generate more and more data in general, a lot of that data is also being processed on devices, so away from some centralized cloud space, and it's being distributed across and being processed also in a distributed manner. That means that we really are also witnessing a very dynamic evolution of the technologies that underpin the data economy, and we have to be ready for that. So in 2020, the Commission issued a communication, Strategy for Data, which basically describes all the elements and all the activities that the Commission wishes to undertake during this Commission's mandate, in order to make sure that indeed we have all these conditions in place for the data to provide all the benefits, socio-economic benefits that we are expecting it to deliver. And as we talk to stakeholders, we continuously talk to stakeholders for a number of years already. And we also have a specific, by the way, study, which is called the European Data Market Study, which monitors the state of the economy. We obviously have a steady inflow of information about how the data economy is developing. And we see that, you know, it's not all just rosy and it's not all great. We have problems that we need to tackle. And this is why the data strategy sort of outlines, first of all, the main problems that we see and how we plan to actually remedy them. So first of all, even though we have so much data being created, there's a little paradox that, first of all, not all of that data is being used. And secondly, there is still not enough data of high quality, a data that is really usable, a data that has a potential to generate value to actually reach the market. So first of all, we still have work to do on public sector information. There's a lot of data locked in the public sector, which is not made available outside of that sector. Secondly, we don't have sufficient mechanisms to make use of private sector data, but also personal data for the public good. So again, a lot of resource being wasted potentially. And to make matters worse, even the companies themselves, the businesses themselves, are relatively slow in taking up, in sharing data, basically. So they may be good in using their own data that they collect themselves, but they're not that good yet in actually making their own data available to others for mutual benefit, or getting data from others to generate benefit because they have a great, innovative idea and a business model that could make use of other companies' data. This is not happening as well, as intensely as we would like it to happen. Second, we have a couple of problems related specifically to what we could call Internet of Things data. So as we could see, there's a lot of data which is going to be processed, let's say, on device in a decentralized manner, and a lot of data that is actually already collected and generated by these devices. And it is not entirely clear as to who has the right to do what, because we have a couple of actors that are clearly important in this constellation, especially the manufacturer of such device and then the user of such connected device. So certain issues with, let's say, legal clarity here that we need to resolve. And also there is an imperfect data portability mechanism when we talk about personal data, because even though we have a GDPR and we have a portability right under the GDPR, it is not really used in practice for several reasons. Well, I think the main of them is that when this portability right was put in place, let's say, we were not yet at that stage of development of various data technologies as we are now, and this would need to be adaptive. In addition to that, we have certain structural sort of macroeconomic problems with the dominance of big tech and big platforms. And this is also very much evident when we look at the data processing services, cloud services. There are just not enough European players there. And what links to what I mentioned before is that companies are not very eager to share data, are not very skilled at that, is that we don't have really any comprehensive data governance approach in Europe. So no kind of pattern or model that the companies could use to share data in confidence. And that, of course, is also exacerbated by other problems related to interoperability of the databases. It's difficult to share data when you cannot really understand what the data is about. More horizontal problem is related to skills shortage and low data literacy. This is a wider problem with digital literacy overall, but it's really acute when it comes to data subjects, and we have not enough data scientists or data workers in the market right now. And on top of that, fragmentation of the single market. So we see certain countries being more developed, more active, more proactive in also putting in place certain legislation to give a certain edge for their companies in the data economy in Europe. And obviously, this is something that we want to avoid. We want to have common rules, and we want to have a functioning internal market also on data. So what does the data strategy propose? Well, as is usually the case, the Commission has two main tools at its disposal. It's legislation on one hand and financial stimuli. And so here we see that indeed we want, or we think that in order to address the problems that I just outlined, we need to have horizontal rules, so cross-sectoral rules, a series of principles that would structure the data economy for at least the next decade. Because we know that a lot of it is happening also on sectoral level. There's legislation in the financial field dealing specifically with financial data. There's energy data legislation. There's legislation on data access in mobility field, in automotive, for instance. So it's not like nothing is happening, but we really need to have some rules that span across all these sectors, and so that we can actually move the whole data economy forward in a more universal, coherent manner, and not just bit by bit and sector by sector. So that is one big element of the data strategy. New legislation, new rules, which will apply horizontally. Enablers, so financial support, specifically in the so-called data spaces to expand, to develop data spaces, and cloud infrastructure, so the structural or IT infrastructure side of data economy. Of course, we need to do something about competences. Here I will not say a lot because this is not really neither our unit or directorate that's dealing with competences. Of course, a lot of that is also actually member state competence, but this is certainly something that the Commission has to support, trying to get more skilled labor force into the market. And I think the last element, which is the establishment or the rollout of the European data spaces, is really a cornerstone of the whole European data strategies that we think, of course, ultimately we want to have a common European data space where data can flow freely from sector to sector, but we have to start somewhere. And probably it's best to start at a domain or sectoral level, because the stakeholders already know each other to a certain extent. There is some sort of data interoperability perhaps developed. There may be already some pioneering collaboration initiatives between different stakeholders. So we need, as a Commission, to step in there and really make sure that we get at some point to this common European data space through the development of sectoral data spaces. And of course, Kimmo will talk about that much more in detail. I'm just here to just outline that apart from money and apart from competences and legislation, it's important to know how actually to get there. And we want to get there through the data spaces idea, enhancing collaboration between different stakeholders, public and private, within those sectoral data spaces in the first stage. Looking at legislation, there are at least, well, I think that these four pieces of legislation on the slide are really the key elements of the data strategy, which were already announced in the data strategy. And if we want to somehow summarize the objective, the main objectives of each of these pieces of legislation in one word, then we can say that we have the Data Act proposal, where the key objective is to ensure fairness in the allocation of value generated out of data across the different stakeholders, the different entities involved in the generation of that data, because currently, of course, we know that data is being used as an asset. We generate wealth, companies have some great business models, but the way this is evolving is not entirely fair. So not all entities that take part in the generation or co-generation of data, get a fair amount in return. So this is something that certainly the Data Act is looking at. Then we have the Data Governance Act, where the key issue is trust. So what I mentioned before, make it easier for companies, but also for public sector entities, researchers, etc., to actually exchange data, to increase their trust, make sure that they are not afraid of making their own data available to others. And Digital Markets Act, something that I think it was a separate Connect University session on this. We know it's much wider because it does not specifically look at data, but it does tackle one of the problems that we see in the data economy is that sort of, again, lack of structural balance. And in fact, there are some dominant entities there that actually impose the rules. And so the market power of the gatekeepers is something that the Digital Markets Act is taking care of. So definitely it does have an impact on the data economy. It's also part of the data strategy. And then a smaller piece of legislation, something that is perhaps thematically more specific, is the list of high-value data sets. It's an implementing regulation based on an open data directive that I will not talk about because the open data directive itself actually precedes the data strategy. It was adopted in 2018, but it contains an obligation for the European Commission to come out with a list of high-value data sets that would help use certain high-quality and high-value data of the public sector for the benefit of commercial reuse, in particularly by startups and SMEs. I'll say a couple of words about each of these pieces of legislation, those that our unit specifically is dealing with. So I will not talk again about the Digital Markets Act, but I will speak about the Data Act, the Data Governance Act, and the High-Value Data Sets Implementing Regulation. If we look at the Data Act, broadly speaking, again, we should say that this is its main role is to ensure fairness, that was already said, but also unlock the value of Europe's industrial data. Industrial data should not be seen as simply some kind of data which is generated during a manufacturing process, for instance, because we're talking about all sorts of industries and all sorts of sectors. The point is here to say that if until now we saw a lot of wealth and a lot of innovation being based on, for instance, personal data, especially if we look at the big platforms and the gatekeepers, we know that the next wave is going to be what we can call industrial data. So not necessarily data generated by consumers, but also data generated by companies, by different connected machines, objects, devices. And this is something that we need to be prepared for, and we need to avoid the situations that we saw until now, where, let's say, certain big players managed to hijack and steer the evolution of the data economy in a certain way. Here we want to be in the driving seat and have our own rules. So clearly, the key overall goal is for the EU to be an important player, if not a global leader in the data economy. And the Data Act is one of the tools that will help us achieve this goal. The Data Act itself is actually thematically very wide. It's a big piece of legislation. It has a couple of chunks in it, all of which are obviously somehow thematically related, but are actually quite distinct as such. So first, I think maybe the most important element, the most important area of regulation is that related to IoT data. And here we have rules on who can access under which conditions the data which are generated by connected devices. I think the main objective we can say is to empower the user, actually. So whereas nowadays the evolution of the data economy in the IoT sector was such that the manufacturers were really in the driving seat, so they could decide how much data they offer anyone else, the data coming from that device, whereas all the data by default would actually come back to the manufacturer. Now what we're trying to see to do is to kind of reverse this trend and to empower the user. So anyone who uses a connected device is by default empowered to access and use that data. And the manufacturer, of course, can also do this, but only in agreement with that user. So this is an important change of focus, of approach as to what happens to data. And generally speaking, the idea is that then that user can assign the data, for instance, also to third-party service providers. So the data is sort of unlocked, but according to or under the conditions and according to the will of the user, not of the manufacturer of these objects. So that is a big element of the Data Act, which looks at the IoT data scenarios. We also tackle contractual unfairness. So there's a chapter in the Data Act which tries to remedy the problems that we see now in contractual relations in the data sharing transactions, whereby often a party with a higher bargaining, stronger bargaining power imposes certain conditions in a sort of take it or leave it manner, and where there's not enough, at least not enough defense in terms of legislation to help these usually smaller companies such as startups to actually resist this kind of imposed terms, imposed contracts on them. So there is a whole chapter which defines terms which are deemed unfair, and in order to protect companies that are on the receiving end, let's say, so companies that need access to data in order to operate, in order to grow. We have another big chapter which was very hotly debated during the co-legislative process. So that is a series of rules that make it easier for the public sector to be able to reach out for data from the private sector in specific circumstances. So you can say making business data available for the public good. In fact, the Data Act uses the term exceptional need, when you have an exceptional need for the data. This was something that's particularly influenced by our experience with the COVID, obviously. So sometimes when you need to fight, especially public emergencies, the public sector needs to get better access to data from the private sector, and the Data Act now makes it easier. On top of that, switchability. So for this particular case of data processing services, we have rules that allow easier switching from one data, let's say, cloud provider to another, to avoid a vendor lock-in situation, which we currently have, and unfortunately is a big blocking factor. And a chapter on interoperability. This is something that we discuss every single time we talk about obstacles in the data economy. Obviously, what we want to have is for the data to be able to flow within sectors and across sectors, and for that, we need better data standards and higher interoperability. The Data Governance Act, on the other hand, this is the one which tackles not fairness issues, but rather trust. It has four main pillars. One, looking at making it possible for more public sector data to be released, let's say, into the market. And that can happen by at least what the Data Governance Act is looking at. Is looking at the data which are not already covered by open data legislation. because there's a lot of data which is held in the public sector, which is closed, which is somehow protected because it's, for instance, covered by intellectual property rights of others, subject to limitations based on personal data protection, or has commercial secrecy concerns. So that kind of data now will be more easily available. There's no obligation to make it available, but there are mechanisms under the Data Governance Act that make it easier and more secure to encourage public sector bodies to actually make that data available. And there's actually a specific register for such protected data which is held by the public sector. It's now also available via the EU data portal. By the way, if you're interested, you can just go there, Google, and have a look at this register. So that tackles public sector side. Now, when we look more about the private sector and about the problem of companies being able to share data within the private sector, we have a specific new set of rules on the so-called data intermediaries. So there is this objective to make sure that we have a kind of European style data intermediaries, not the kind of data brokers that are very often already present in the market that are likely to sort of offer you a service whereby they help you share your data with someone else, but at the same time they benefit from your data. This is something that many companies, many companies see as unfair and something that is actually discouraging them from making their data available. So now we have a series of rules for European style data intermediaries that will make data sharing safe, which are also subject to an EU, there will be an EU register of data intermediation services. Such intermediation services will be certified on the national level, and they will receive a logo as a kind of a sign of recognition, so that companies that want to share their data in a safe manner can do so through those data intermediaries without having a fear that their data will be misused or will leak, and will be maybe some insights will be generated from that data, which we then use against them. So data intermediaries as a tool to make data market more fluid and make data flow. Data altruism, this is another problem that I outlined before, is the fact that there's a lot of data which could be used for public good, which is held by companies or by us individuals. There is no mechanism so far, or there was no mechanism so far before the arrival of the Data Governance Act, and now we have the possibility to share data via data altruism organizations, which have also their common logo. They have to abide to certain rules regarding transparency, regarding security of the data that they handle. These are the organizations which take care of the data to be used then for the public good, that also means that they are non-profit. I mean, they are not supposed to charge you for the data that you or me would like to make available, for instance, for some public health purposes or in order to fight climate change, etc. And the fourth pillar of the Data Governance Act is related to the establishment of the EDIB, so the European Data Innovation Board. And this is also something that was missing. It's kind of data governance really on the high level, on European level. And now with that European Data Innovation Board, we'll have a kind of a mechanism and a body, a structure, helping the Commission also and advising the Commission in all matters related to the development of data spaces, the development of the data economy in general, interoperability aspects, standardization, enforcement of the Data Governance Act, and other, because actually under the Data Act, this European Data Innovation Board was given some additional tasks. So the point is, we now have a specific high-level governance body which deals with data topics, data policy issues on the European level and can exchange information on that level. And the last bit is the high-value datasets list, which is linked to the Open Data Directive from 2019. So here we are again going back to the topic of public sector data, which also the Data Governance Act tackles to some extent. But here we are talking about the data which is already reusable. So we are not talking about protected data, but we are talking about specific subset of reusable data. We are talking about data which are really important for the businesses, which have a high reuse potential, and where, in fact, one of the problems until now was that this data was very often available only against compensation. So that constituted a certain barrier for the smallest companies and startups, for instance. Often it was not available in harmonized machine-readable formats and was not that easily actually accessed in terms of technical accessibility. So was not, for instance, available via APIs. And so what we do here with the high-value datasets list is that we define sets of data in 6 thematic domains that you see on the slide, from geospatial to mobility. We have identified these as being the most important, of highest value, and we ensure that these particular data sets are going to be available free of charge in machine-readable formats and via APIs. So giving real boost to the reuse of public sector information in Europe. And that was my last slide. Sorry, this is a wide domain to talk about within 30 minutes, but I'm very happy to receive questions now. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I can see from the chat that it has been quite very much appreciated. So thanks a lot for these. And we do have a few questions, so be prepared for some grilling. I'll start from a market perspective. I'll cluster 3 questions here. So first, the most popular question is, do you foresee that the US and China will adopt similar data regulations? Because we really talked about Europe now. So what you see happens overseas and in Asia. And what feedback you're getting from the market regarding a big tech data dominance? Do you have any exchange on this topic with the stakeholders you've been consulting? And last question on market, a bit provocative, is, do you really believe that adding more legislation on data will allow our companies to grow quickly and be competitive with, for example, US big companies? So difficult questions, I know, but the floor is yours.
Yes, well, I mean, it's true. It's true. This is one approach that, you know, might be valid for some to say, perhaps if we just leave just the market to settle this, we'll actually unleash more innovation than setting a number of rules. But I think the point here was that, you know, this kind of laissez-faire attitude showed in the past that, yes, perhaps you will have a lot of database innovation and growth, but this may very well go to some particular multinational groups, for instance, and the distribution of that data value that I was talking about will not be very fair. So overall, there will be innovation, but will Europe benefit from that? So I think that was one of the reasons why we actually decided to have common rules to set the common grounds. But again, the idea would be that once we have them, we are not going to then continuously add on top of that. But this would be the horizontal layer, and let's hope that the next 5-10 years shows us that this is a kind of a stable framework that does not need to be modified anymore. Now, when you look about those Chinese or American or other competitors, indeed, this has always been an issue. And in the discussions, for instance, on the Data Act, we actually have specific rules that protect European data holders, European companies, for instance, from making, maybe not all of their data, but specifically making their trade secrets available to companies with whom they would not like to share their trade secrets, because these companies are, well, likely to abuse those trade secrets. So there's a rather complicated mechanism which makes it, which protects trade secrets in the case where the data leaves the device. Okay, so this is something that was very much also debated, and clearly a lot of European manufacturers were concerned. I think now they are much less concerned because of these specific mechanisms which they have. And also under the Data Act, we have specific rules which say that the gatekeepers, which are designated under the Digital Markets Act, should not have access to data which are made available thanks to the new rights under the Data Act. They cannot have the data as a so-called third party. So basically, if I'm a user of a connected product and that product generates data, I, under the Data Act, have the right to, of course, get the data myself and also to ask the data holder, the manufacturer in many cases, to make that data available to a third party, a company of my choice that wishes to provide a service to me. Under the Data Act, I can do this, but if that third company is a gatekeeper, it actually cannot put itself in a position of a third party. It cannot accept that data from me. So we're saying, yes, well, the gatekeepers, they can still continue working and operating in the data economy, but they cannot really benefit from the new rights under the Data Act because they're already in a very privileged position vis-a-vis everyone else. So we want to empower specifically everyone else and not the gatekeepers themselves. So again, some safeguards are there to look to prevent, let's say, the leakage of data overseas, but we'll see if it's sufficient, and we'll see how that works.
And what are you seeing happening in the US and China? Will they follow suit?
Sorry?
Will the states, the United States and China, will they also follow suit in the regulation or not? What do you believe?
Well, we know that China is not particularly keen on regulating data, artificial intelligence, etc. They have the reasons for that, but they have obviously a completely different, let's say, legal environment, including the fact that the fundamental rights that we cherish so much, especially related to personal data protection, of course, in China have a completely different meaning. So I think it's difficult for me to foresee or to anticipate now whether China will do something like that. I think the United States are much more likely because we've seen some initiatives, maybe not on the federal level yet, but we could see, for instance, a lot of activity and discussions related to, again, for the moment, this is very often driven by specific sectors, which are much more advanced, for instance, in using the value of data, such as automotive. And we decided to have a horizontal approach. And on top of that, we still can have sectoral legislation. I think the United States for the moment is looking at it from sort of the other way around. So we look sector by sector, and then perhaps they would also have some horizontal rules on top of that. But so yes, I'm expecting the United States to follow suit, and just hopefully this does not lead to sort of conflicting approaches, because obviously we ideally would also like data to flow, across the countries as well, because I think it's a universal resource. But for the moment, we are focused on making sure that we in Europe can generate wealth out of it.
No, that's very clear and understood. Thanks a lot. And one last question. It's going a bit back into technical grounds, so no more scary question, but could you explain a bit more what data brokers are? Because the concept appears to be interesting to our audience, but not fully clear. So what are data brokers?
Data brokers I may have used a sort of more generic term, but the Data Governance Act uses the same data intermediaries or data intermediary services. And if we are talking about that, it's actually companies normally that link the supply side of data with the demand side of data. So they help those who have data and are ready to share it with someone else find that someone else who's interested in their data, because this is one of the big issues that we have in the European economy. How do you we don't really have a stock market for data, for instance, right? So we cannot that easily share it, and the data is a kind of resource which becomes obsolete very fast. So we really need to make it easier for companies to, on the one hand, discover the data that they want, they're interested in, on the other hand, make it available to them by someone else. And the problem is that current data broker solutions that are in the market, many of them operate in such a way that that data broker company will host your data and somehow facilitate finding a client for you, but at the same time, they are also going to use your data for their own business benefit. And this is why many companies are not keen on entrusting their data with them. So the data intermediary under the Data Governance Act is an intermediary which is forbidden from doing such things with the data. All they are supposed to do is to link, as I said, the supply and the demand side. They can use data only to the extent that it helps them improve their service to their clients, to the entity entrusting the data and the entity that wants to use that data. So you have a guarantee that your data is not going to be misused, and in particular isn't going to be misused against you, because this has happened, for instance, with the big platform solutions, whereby a lot of companies were hosting their data there, and then they basically realized that through different complicated algorithms, and that platform actually managed to derive insights about, for instance, your business just by hosting and managing your data. So these kind of things, under the European approach to data brokerage or data intermediary, are going to be forbidden, and we hope that this is going to lead to encourage data sharing to a much higher extent than is currently the case.
Thank you very much. Much clearer now. We will now move a bit to a different topic, which is data spaces and what's happening on the ground. So for this, I will welcome Gianfranco Cecconi, a representative of the Data Spaces Support Center, which will discuss a bit with us. Gianfranco, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Beatrice. Can you see my screen? And I assume you're hearing me well. So thanks for inviting me. I'm filling in for Professor Boris Otto, who is Project Director for Data Spaces Support Center, a project to support the development of European data spaces that has today about 1 year of life since it really started. I will take the role of Executive Director from November. So this is a way of baptism of fire for me. I'm very happy to be here, but I've been close to the implementation of the European data strategy for a very long time. I led for the Publications Office the DataEurope.eu program for open data. I've been leading the predecessor to Data Space Support Center called Support Center for Data Sharing. And so this is a natural continuation for me. I'm very happy to take you with me on this content, and I will try not to use all the time available to me so that you can make questions at the end. Let's start from the basics that are often sometimes controversial, because the definition is difficult to give for what we call a data space. We've been using the term a lot of time in the last half an hour or so. The way we call it, let's say a working definition, is that a data space is a distributed system defined by a governance framework that enables trustworthy data transactions between participants while supporting trust and data sovereignty. I'll go quickly through these terms because I believe it is useful. The distributed system, some of us may prefer saying decentralized system, is making the main point that perhaps came through also Simon's word, that is, we do not want a central entity, a central data intermediary, to gain superpowers in a situation where participants exchange data. We know what happens when that is the situation. The model of data spaces that the European Commission is promoting is avoiding by design that kind of imbalance. The governance framework is simply the element of the rules that the participants in this data space situation give themselves. And it includes also the legal framework they move within. So it's not just about the rules that the participants to the space set for themselves, but also the legislation, in this case, say, the European Union, and the ones that apply depending on the case of the specific space. Trust is a strong word, sometimes abused as well. the simple point here is that we use this to refer to anything that refers to feeling comfortable in sharing. Also another point made by Simon earlier. It includes security, the protection of confidential data, the protection of personal data when it is shared, and so on. And finally, data sovereignty, a term that is becoming very common in Europe. It simply refers to the fact that your rights over the data that you hold are going to be recognized, respected, and enforced, and you will be free to exercise them. I believe it's clear so far, but again, to help you getting into the concept, let's also see to what data space is not. I believe that is particularly interesting because often it's a matter of misunderstanding. So a data space is not a data lake. It's not just a piece of technology. It's not a place where you put all the data from a technological perspective. It's very far from that, actually. It's rather the possibility to exchange data without necessarily having a shared platform, let's say, that is at the center of the system. The data space is not either just its participants, as much as they are important and they are integral to the definition itself. It's not just about them. And then it's not just a platform, so the technology they use, and it's not the ecosystem they belong to, whether it is, let's say, a digital level, say the cloud, or a data level. Data sharing still is out there. Data spaces are simply a specific way that by design implements data sharing in a way that is, as we said earlier, trustworthy and sovereign. There's another view that I can give you that perhaps can also help you, let's say, just to make the content, make the meaning very, very solid in your heads. That is, a data space may be seen as a federated data ecosystem based on shared policies and rules. Whether you are individuals, companies, subject matter expertise, small and medium enterprises, research institutions, and so on, the standards for interoperability and the governance that we described earlier will enable you to share data in this space. For the more, let's say, techies among us, you may say, you may say that it is a data integration concept that does not require common database schemas or physical data integration. It's like saying that the data travels from the data offerer to the data consumer only on as needed basis. We said earlier that we build on top of many other concepts, and it is useful to be awareness of that, even just to think in terms of value chain. The digital ecosystem is the base, of course, of what we build on. The most often cloud systems, so the systems we have in our offices or at home. The data element is something probably we are comfortable using, more or less all of us, business in particular, before going into the data sharing element of it, that again, it's possible also without data spaces, and it's been around for a while. The data space element on top of that adds even further value by adding that element of trust and sovereignty and that design character that avoids abuse. And finally, of course, the use cases, the actual application. What do we do with this data that complements the value chain that gets down to the end user of the service rather than the data itself? In the EU context, we often talk about also common European data space. I believe the term came out earlier also in Simon's presentation. What we call common European data space is simply spaces, plural. It's simply the set of sector-focused or topic-focused data spaces that the European Union has been funding and developing and promoting its development over the last year or so. There are a few of them. You must have seen this slide before, I'm sure. And they tend to address, according to priority, several sectors, as you see, health, or manufacturing, agriculture, finance, and so on. We will get back to this point later, but many of these at the moment are just in a sort of an embryonic stage where we are exploring what the needs of each of these sectors are. On the right, you can see that little box pointing in with public sector open data, high-value data sets, and protected data from the DGA that Simon listed earlier. Nobody stops open data or data publicly available to be reused in data spaces as well. It's just natural to consider the European Union's Data Europa.eu as a possible, most likely source to discover them and find them and reuse them. There are many other sources. So Data Europa.eu may see also as part of this picture. The Data Spaces Support Center, the project I'm part of, is responsible in just two liners of what you see on screen, coordinating the development and assuring common standards and interoperability. We will spend more time on this in a moment. And underneath all of these, there are elements of technical infrastructure. There are many of them. I will tell you in particular about something we call Simple, because it is such an important element of support for the European data spaces that it's worth absolutely naming. So who are the actors of this picture? Who is moving in this common European data space? Of course, the Data Space Support Center, as I said, responsible for the coordination of all relevant actions. It will produce assets like blueprints, best practices, common standards, and it will actually support the activities. It is a co-creation exercise. So we engage every day with the data spaces themselves and the initiatives that are preparing for those data spaces. That is actually the second point you see in this slide. Many of what we call data space initiatives today are in reality just those embryonic stages thereof. So they are coordination and support actions created by the European Union to pave the way for those sector domain-specific data spaces. They include community of practice. They set and define what the priority data sets to be unleashed are to enable that sector. They manage the stakeholder related to that sector and so on. This is also, of course, perhaps I should have said earlier, funded by the Digital Europe program. And by the way, we have already a few data spaces out there, and they are actual operations like the cultural heritage data space and the data space for language. In different kind of form, perhaps without calling themselves data space, they've been around for quite a long time. We may, if you look at them closely, they may not yet match that definition I gave you earlier, but the ambition is to move towards that. If you visit Europeana, for example, that is the name of the cultural heritage data space, you will have a good idea of what the service provides you with today. You will not see in any way the structure and the design, if it is decentralized or not underneath, but you have a good idea of what the service may look like on the long term, whether or not it assumes and it matches specific the definition. With the organizations operating the services, we are working to get to that objective. The European Data Innovation Board, Simon explained earlier what it is a consultative and advisory body. I believe it is planned for kicking off very, very soon, and it will provide guidelines for interoperability to the common European data space. I believe the EDIB is both explicitly referred to in the Data Governance Act and also in the Data Act, so it will have quite a significant influence on every EU project in this space coming, let's say, channeling the directions from the Commission, and let's say using the Data Space Support Center as a sort of an expert body advising them and complementing their own capabilities and understanding and experience of these topics. And finally, Simple. Simple is called sometimes less, let's say, concisely, the smart middleware platform for cloud-to-edge federations and data spaces. It is the common infrastructure that will be offered to the common European data spaces to operate their services. It is made of three parts. The first is a major, really large-scale operation of developing or curating pre-existing open source software components that will provide all the functionalities needed to the data spaces. I could talk for a very long time on this, but we'll get back on the components later. So this is just the open source software. It will be made available to anybody, not just to the EU data spaces themselves. So the ambition here is to implicitly offer the whole of the data economy a reference implementation for how to do, again, trustworthy and sovereign data spaces. Simple Live will be the production-grade software as a service that will provide Simple Open to the common European data space. So as soon as they are ready and they want to start deploying the actual data space, Simple Live will give them live operations now components. I don't want to call it the platform on purpose, just not to recall that kind of central principle we want to avoid. And the last bit is Simple Labs, similar to Simple Live in concept, but focused only on experimental components. So that is where we will probably deploy the more recent or the more wild implementations of functionality for data spaces. Simple also, funded by the Digital Europe program. So let's now go in a bit more detail in what the Data Space Support Center does and how perhaps it is relevant to your work. The mission is to enable new European data space to a faster start and to a faster scale up. It is intended to provide tools to address basic organizational and technical matters required by each of the data spaces that the EU is promoting. We will not go necessarily into the detail of the specific data space. For example, we may not explore topics specific to agriculture or to manufacturing, but we will create the standards and the guidance for the general build of the data spaces and their interoperability between the data spaces themselves. One of our main outputs will be what we call a blueprint. Actually, the very first preview version has been published last week. That includes best practices, a selection of common standards, and reference implementation that are created with that co-creation process I told you about. We are, let's say, going to market, looking out there, asking our stakeholders for standards that work best, the practices that work best. We match them against the European values and the objectives by the Commission, and we then offer them back to the data spaces to adopt. And finally, of course, as I said earlier, we need to enable the individual data spaces to focus on their domain-specific challenge, because those will actually provide the benefits to the participants of the data spaces to come. And us, we at the SSC, will remain supporting, let's say, underneath that activity. This picture summarizes the set of assets that we are working on and we will keep maintaining for the duration of the project. There's about 2 and 3 years more to go. The starter kit is something that it's a relatively good read, I would say. Any of you that is new to the topic can simply read to have an idea of what we're talking about. The blueprint is the collection of all those reference guides I told you before, and again, recently available for consultation. It is made of 3-4 parts, depending on how you count them. The first is a glossary, the second a conceptual model to describe data spaces, and the third is the collection of building blocks and standards that can implement that conceptual model. We will go back to that in a moment. The Radar will be launched soon, is simply a sort of a catalog of the data spaces we know about, so that you can use it as for reference and see how the others have addressed the challenge of build a functional, sustainable data space. The maturity model is a series of principles and values by which we suggest how to define the maturity of a data space. The taxonomy is a series of characteristics by which we describe a data space that will be useful particularly for, say, benchmarking or analyzing, comparing different experiences. All of these are offered on a support platform, particularly a website that any of you can use. And of course, it includes the feedback, the continuous interaction with a network of stakeholders is quite large. We also offer an annual conference, usually in March, to engage with our audience in a more direct way. As I said earlier, the blueprint is just released. That is where you find it. I won't spend too much time again because I'm very interested in your questions. This is what the structure, so the conceptual, this is how the blueprint is structured. The green areas are the ones we just published. The yellow ones will come. So the element of RefSys implementation and best practices, for example, will be quite useful as the data space go into building and operation stage. Some of these elements were not ready, let's say, by last week, and the topic is still relatively new for many of the organizations and research institutions involved in the process. So we are trying to collect the best we have in a way that is robust enough for reference without confusing, let's say, our audience too much. The glossary, exactly for that point of not computing, is quite important. It tries to develop and offer a common language by which we describe data spaces. I mean, the topic is so new that sometimes we still use different terminology to use the same thing. This, you can imagine, creates a lot of confusion. I told you earlier, I had a lot of experience also in the open data part of the scene, and on some terms, even there, we are still arguing about how to call things. So this was one of the first effort that we put into the project to offer that vocabulary. The conceptual model similarly creates a kind of a visual representation of the concept, what belongs to what relates to what, again, to create a reference for describing data spaces to each other and to ourselves. In a way, also to cover all of the boxes we need to tick when we design one. Have we thought about the roles? Have we thought about the infrastructure? Do we know what the governance framework is, and so on? We call it at the moment level 1 because we imagine both a level 0, say when we look at multiple data spaces as a federation, a level higher, but also level 2. Each of those boxes offers themselves to be decomposed in its own components without going too complicated. At this level, the blueprint offers this level 1. And that is possibly where most of the effort went, that is the list of building blocks. This work, by the way, is not completely original. It builds of academia and research done before us. So we are, let's say, privileged curators of content that was developed before as well. You can see there are both organizational and business building blocks on one side and more technical building blocks on the other. I won't go into the detail because it will take a lot of time, but I will share later a link to a webinar we actually hosted yesterday, 12th of October, that goes into more detail about each of these. So how to stay up to date? I'm sure you will have access to the slides later. There's news and publication that we publish regularly. There are thematic groups by which you can work with us. There's a monthly Insight series webinar we host. And of course, you're very welcome to visit us in March at the next symposium that I believe will be hosted in Germany, but we haven't yet decided where and when exactly. But I'm sure I will see you there. And I believe this is all for me, Beatrice. We can take questions if you like.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very clear. And when you mentioned the glossary and unifying languages, you had a lot of support from the ground, as indeed having clear definitions is and having a clear understanding of what exactly we are talking about is seen as a big problem and causing a lot of confusion in our audience as well. So thanks a lot for your work on glossary and language. But going into questions. Well, first, quite interesting is how do you see the openness of participants of your community in sharing data? Because everyone wants to harvest the benefits, but when they have to put their own resources, their own information, they may be hesitant. Is this what you see, or no, we have a very active and open community?
This reminds me actually that it's useful to clarify how we use the term open here. The Common European Data Spaces are open, meaning that we don't want to be discriminatory on the participants. So that's the very first point. The EU wants data spaces to be open to any participant. And that's a decision by design. Not all data spaces need to be that way. You may see the difference between a club reserved to a few friends and the one instead that accepts any kind of membership. So that's the first point. We are open to any participant in Europe as long as they play by the governance, the rules for the game that we defined. The second point, how open to share, how open to participate. That's more about the business model that takes you to that data space. In the past, data sharing was sometimes called also monetization. It's a term that I always disliked because it implies a transfer of money. It doesn't need to be that way. The reason by which you participate to a data space is the sharing for whatever purpose, whether it is creating new services or improving your effectiveness in how you operate, research and development. In some cases, data spaces are useful even just to counter, say, a much larger player in your market. So by coming together with other organizations and sharing interest and with data resources, you may become stronger in participating to a market. All of this breaks perhaps the traditional way by which we see protecting our own data as if it was a matter of competitive advantage. And I will close on that point. I would challenge that today your competitive advantage relies on the fact that you know something that I don't know. I believe the World Economic Forum recently published exactly research stating that today competitive advantage is more about your capability to collaborate with others than protecting your secret information.
That's indeed very true. And now shifting a bit focus on what you are doing to pave the ground for the data spaces. Two questions. One is, you mentioned governance. How do you ensure effective governance? Because on paper it is one thing, on practice is possibly another. And the other one is, well, there are a lot of tools, a lot of artifacts out there. How do you choose the ones which should become the building blocks for data spaces?
Okay, two very different questions. Let's start from the first. I would say modern governance is made of two elements. Let's say the more human, soft one, the one perhaps that the person asked on paper, let's say, and the one that is more enforceable from a technical perspective. The kind of technology we have available today allows us to move as much as possible of the enforcement of the governance down to the technology level. I'm not saying that tech will solve all problems, but I'm saying that the kind of security and encryption and cryptography and so on that we have today make incredibly more feasible than it used to be even just like 6 years ago to build elements of governance within the technology itself. Now, some of it will not go there. So, for example, the enforcement of legislation cannot go down to technology level. So it will still be up to goodwill humans to enforce it. But yeah, you need to see effective governance as a combination of the two. The challenge is not new, by the way. Think about the General Data Protection Regulation. We know what the principles are, all happy, but then we know how difficult it is to enforce or to fine the violators in ways that are, I believe that's a formula for that, effective, detrimental, I don't remember, but you got the idea. There's always a combination. And the smarter we are in balancing and taking advantage of the technology side, the better we will be. The second question is, how do we choose those building blocks? So as I said earlier, it's a collaborative process with the coordinated support actions and the other stakeholders that collaborate with us. The members of Data Space Support Center that work on this research and technology organizations that have been studying this stuff for a very long time. I won't go into detail of the methodology to select them. The interesting bit is that we will offer always multiple options for each of those functionalities. The building blocks are just, say, virtual capabilities that need to be covered by a piece of software or something else in the case of the technology building blocks. Just to make a very down-to-earth example, many of you, perhaps a strong word, some of you may have heard about how the connector component of a data space is very important. The connector covers multiple building blocks, and multiple implementation of the connector in the real world exist. There's one from the Eclipse Foundation, there's one from Fraunhofer Institute in Germany, there's one from the TNO institution in the Netherlands. So, and the blueprint offers all of this. So you will have an idea of what the building blocks that you probably expect in your data space is, what possible implementation are there, and the list of the actual implementation that we have put to the test or were recommended to us by our stakeholders.
Thank you very much. Very clear now. And looking a bit into the future, because now we are at the beginning of a journey to build the data spaces. how close you see the end of it, or not really the end, but at least the deployment to the market, to the actualization of this dream. How far are we?
So there's no end to it, Beatrice is going to. Well, I don't expect, well, I will retire in perhaps in 20 years, I don't know, something like that. I expect there will be still work to do. But, you know, sometimes we call data spaces as a sort of an infrastructure. And we are used to other kinds of infrastructure, like, I don't know, water distribution, power distribution. And you get to the end of it, you get to the maturity stage when you don't see it. So when you buy a house, you don't need to worry too much about, are there pipes of fresh water coming into my house? Are there wires of electricity coming in? No, you don't wonder about that. You don't need to, because we got to a point of maturity when this infrastructure is permeating the living space where we inhabit. And the same will be for data spaces. The end game of this is that the technology we can use, the governance models, the legal framework, also thanks to the work of Simon and the other colleagues, will get to a point where we may not need to worry about the basics because they're taken care of. We may only need to worry about the top level of that value chain I displayed earlier, the use cases, because that is where we want to focus. Today, because the rest of the stack is a bit immature, when someone starts a data sharing operation, needs to perhaps spend much more effort than it could be, because they need to take care about how deep they need to go. The end game is I will need just to worry about the use case level at the top. Everything else will be taken care of by the legislator, by the techies working with me, and by the experience of the many other stakeholders working with us and offering back their experience.
Thank you. And then one last question before moving to the next section. So there was a question on how the Data Space Support Center compares to other activities, because you are focusing on European common data spaces, but there is more outside. Can you share a word in this? And there was a mention on Gaia-X. Gaia-X is obviously a partner of the Data Space Support Center, so you are working together, but they also have other activities in the data space world. So is everything fully complementary? Is it overlapping? How do you see it?
It's a very dynamic and alive space, and like, by the way, for every new kind of paradigm by which we work together or we develop technology. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Java as a programming language came out, and it was quite messy at the beginning, competing implementations, people claiming I am the right standard. No, I am the right standard, and you should do it like I do it, and so on. That is absolutely normal. It may be painful to some, but it's unfortunately normal. It's a sign of how interesting this thing is for the many of us. Industry associations are very active. Gaia-X is one of these, developing standards, particularly for the federated cloud layer of the stack, let's say more on the, it's difficult to say visually, but yeah, that is where Gaia-X is. My employer in the SSC is actually another industry association, that is the International Data Spaces Association, that is focusing more on the data space level. There are multiple open source let's say institutions taking care of implementing this, like the Eclipse Foundation that I may have named earlier. Now, if you try to put them together like the pieces of a puzzle, they may not match perfectly because it's very early days. But I can say, promise on my personal feeling of this, that we are all working in the same direction. So again, see the sharp corners as a sign of a very dynamic and creative environment. Over time, we'll get to a point of maturity where you won't feel that kind of discomfort anymore. Besides, moving within the Data Spaces Support Center guidance, you will have a relatively consistent environment, and the common European data spaces are invited to do that. This does not mean that the others are wrong. Major data spaces like, say, Catena-X for the automotive industry, that is not strictly related to the EU, is doing great work. It's just great. I mean, we can learn from them, they can learn from us, and keep integrating and offering to the others what we learned.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Thank you very much for your participation and your time. And we will now move to the last bit. Last but not least, Kimmo Rossi will introduce us to the technology portfolio and to our research and innovation activities. Kimmo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Beatrice. I will share my presentation. Okay, can you see it now? Okay, I assume that you can see my slides. So thank you very much for Shimon and Gianfranco for this very precise and complete presentation. Now, actually, I don't have much to do here. I'm just going to fill a little gap. The third pillar, which is the project portfolio that we have to support all these things that were described and to make it happen: data market, the legislation, the data spaces. And of course, the Data Space Support Center that Gianfranco just described is actually one of the projects in our portfolio. So you have already seen one of the projects. Now there are two possible approaches in presenting a portfolio. One is to present the work program. So how do we describe this support in the work program, the support to legislation and policy? And the other alternative is to present the actual projects that result from this work program. And I find the latter more fruitful because it gives a more realistic picture of what is happening. And sometimes, often, it happens that the project portfolio starts to lead a life of its own, which may actually depart from what we foresaw in the work program text. This is usually only positive because this way the project portfolio can respond to the changing world and to the current situations and emergencies much better than what we can do by writing work programs, because typically we write the work programs 2 years before the action happens. The role or the tasks of the project portfolio, to put it very simply, it's these 4 aspects. First of all, we expect the projects to promote research and innovation. Secondly, to support the support the EU policies and help to implement the EU policies. Then we need the projects to support legislation from 2 perspectives. From the enforcement perspective, so the legislators or the controlling authorities enforcement activity, but also the compliance aspect. So those that are covered to have to operate under the legislation, how can they comply with this increasingly complex and technical legislation that Shimon described? And finally, a situation where we are also implementing a European partnership. Actually, it used to be a public-private partnership in the old terminology, the Horizon 2020. That was the big data value partnership, and now we are moving towards the new European partnership under Horizon Europe, which is the AI, data, and robotics partnership. The presentation and my approach is divided to 2 stages, because you have to take a historical perspective to understand what is the background of what has already happened during the Horizon 2020 program and in the Connecting Europe facility, the CEF program, which all happened under the first data strategy. We were creating the basics or trying to understand what the data economy is, and to enable cross-border, cross-sector data flows, pretty much in a setup of one-to-one or one-to-few, and typically business-to-business settings. We had Lighthouse projects, data hubs, open data actions. Then the current period, which is what the previous speakers actually described, which happens under the second data strategy that was shaped in 2020, and then the Horizon Europe and the Digital Europe funding programs. So now it's very clear, more concrete. We are now setting up the common European data spaces and the related governance and the interoperability that it takes, and and trying to see how the European rules and values are applied in concrete data operations, compliance. And we are moving now towards all kinds of data sharing, whether it's between government, businesses and citizens alike, from X to Y, where any of these actors come into play. Just a few figures that what I'm now describing consists of about 70 plus active actions. Most of them are grants, but some are procurement actions. 8 still ongoing Horizon 2020 projects. Then the majority from Horizon Europe, the cluster 4 and 5 actions, and then 25 Digital Europe actions, and they are mostly the data space actions. Now I want to make clear at this point that we are not managing in our unit Connect G1 all these projects. Many of them, especially the data spaces, are managed by the units or the other commission services in other DGs who are the experts in the domain of the data space. Now, let's quickly show you this ugly picture, which shows the background, the historical developments and the project portfolios in terms of blocks. I don't have a block for every single topic of the work program, but the most central one of them is that for this presentation. And what you see here on the left side in green color is the past, Horizon 2020 and the CEF program, how it develops into the current Digital Europe and Horizon Europe actions. For example, if we think about the compliance technologies that we are now working on in Horizon, compliance with legislation, compliance with the Green Deal objectives. We had a predecessor, of course, very much inspired by the GDPR, which came into application in 2018. So we had a portfolio of projects on privacy preserving technology, and then we applied them in data platforms that I will shortly present to you as well. And now this has developed to a new line of action in the Horizon Europe work program, which is compliance technology, so which is actually a portfolio, several portfolios of projects. And then Simon presented the open data actions that were already initiated in the CEF program, and now one particular thing that Simon also mentioned in his last slides, the high value data sets, they are the kind of open data that we are now supporting also in the Digital Europe program with specific grants. And all these, or most of these boxes, there is an arrow leading to the data spaces here in the middle. So that we are currently at the end of the first wave of the data spaces, first phase of the data spaces, which come in 2 waves, and this is the preparatory actions, and we are then moving to the more exciting phase, which is then to start to deploy and populate these data spaces. So as I said, there are two phases in this supporting data spaces, supporting the policies. Under Horizon 2020, we supported, we piloted what we called data platforms. People may understand data, different things under data platforms, but this is what we, our terminology, according to our terminology, was the portfolio of 9 projects that were creating the first prototypes or demonstrators of what could then later on develop into a data space. And these were typically safe sandboxes where you can study the concepts and the challenges of the real world without facing the risks of the real world, so that all the players in these sandboxes have signed agreements or consent that they are okay with the use of their data for the purposes of this sandbox, even if things may accidentally go wrong and personal data being disclosed, for example, then big damage is not made. And we had quite interesting picture of what situation may arise and how to tackle the practical compliance issues, which mostly in that time was GDPR, because it was the only piece of legislation that was applicable at the time when these projects were running. I just take one example. All these projects have now ended. Data Vaults is maybe one of the more ambitious projects because they wanted to address everything in one project. So first of all, personal data and all the privacy concerns, analytics, and sharing and trading of personal data, which may seem scary, but then again, this was a safe sandbox. It was relatively risk-free to experiment it in a project like this, and they did this in 5 demonstrators in areas ranging from health to smart home and municipal services. And why I actually took this as an example, because this project has published a nice open access e-book, Personal Data Smart Cities, which not only describes the Data Vaults project, but a whole portfolio of projects around this theme of data platforms. So now the second phase, where we are now. We are moving to deployment of the data spaces that is supported by the Digital Europe program. So now we start to talk about data spaces, and Gianfranco has very nicely outlined what are the characteristics of a data space. So I don't need to go back to that. But the common themes and characteristics that manifest in the current project portfolio that are supporting this, it's that we will almost always have some kind of compliance technologies. Now we tend to talk more about compliance technologies, and privacy preservation is just one of those, but there are other aspects of compliance. And the green data operations is actually one aspect of the compliance as well, because we also need to comply with the Green Deal objectives of reaching zero net emissions by 2050. So data operations are traditionally very resource intensive and power consuming, so that they can make a big difference on the environmental footprint. So we also have to start to take a data life cycle approach, look at the data life cycle from the creation or collection of the data all the way to the final archival or deletion, destroying of the data, which also is maybe an obligation, a compliance obligation under GDPR when we are talking about personal data. And increasingly, we see the convergence of data and AI. It is becoming more and more difficult to keep the two concepts apart from each other, because you are using, of course, data more and more to develop AI services and systems. But on the other hand, data operations are also governed by the use of AI systems. Data spaces, I just show the picture of all the data spaces. I think Gianfranco's slide, there were 10 of them, but now we have 14 of them. They are mushrooming, so that it's sometimes difficult to keep track of how many data spaces there are. And what I can here just say, underline what Gianfranco already mentioned, that all the data spaces are different. So all of them have their own business case, and you cannot have a sort of universal approach to data spaces. This slide, don't worry, I will not go through all these projects. This is just an illustration from a funding agency's point of view of how these data space projects are supported. It's not as simple as you may think, that it is only they are supported through the DEP, Digital Europe program. Most of them are, of course, but then, for example, energy data space has already been supported under the Horizon Europe program with these 5+1 ongoing projects because of the historical things. And then we also have one, the health data space pilot funded under the EU for Health program. But then most of the data spaces where we now are reaching the end of the preparatory phase, they are funded indeed in the Digital Europe program. And we are for some data spaces, we are already in the deployment phase. And Gianfranco mentioned the language data space and the cultural heritage data space. I'm also mentioning the components that will be part of the future upcoming health data space, which is not in place yet, because it requires a regulation, the European Health Data Space Regulation, to be adopted first. But there are already some nice instantiations of parts of it. For example, the European Cancer Imaging Initiative, where the first prototype was just recently released in September, and populated with cancer image data and helping health professionals to treat diseases better and to save patients' lives. Now, if I have time, I still have a few minutes left. I also want to leave some time for questions. I have some examples of projects. I cannot go much into the detail of what these projects are about, who is in the project and so far. But I just mentioned that, for example, for the enabling data market or treating data as a commodity or doing trading with data and also compliance, I can mention these two projects. Upcast, for example, is a nice brand new project that is addressing, for example, the automatic negotiation of agreement terms, so that these agreements that Simon was talking about, there are so many of them, they are so frequently, you need to conclude agreements that it's impossible to think that you do all of that manually. There must be also some sort of automation in concluding agreements on data use, because data is used on the fly and situations change all the time. Dynamic fair pricing. Pricing is a very tricky matter for data assets, because there is not really a model or a precedent how data assets should be priced. Then, of course, the privacy and the commercial confidentiality requirements that are when you're dealing with personal data or closed industrial data. And this project is also looking at lowering the environmental footprint and compliance with relevant legislation and ethical and responsible practices. Then we also need, if we want to have this, that Simon said that we don't have it yet, but maybe in the future, if we have technologies and mechanisms for treating data as financial assets or money, with the same traceability and the same level of trust, we could then actually start just a second. I need to plug in the power. Just a moment, otherwise you will lose me. So I realized that my battery is running low. Okay, now problem fixed, because I had plugged my laptop to a dead socket. So now I should be fine. So FAME project is looking at this embedded finance and federated data marketplace, blockchain, cryptography, and all these aspects that make increase the traceability of assets. That's something that you need in a functioning market. Then green data operation, as I said, it's an overarching topic that most of the projects are addressing it, or they need to address it. But we have a project Glaciation, which is specialized in this area of reducing the energy consumption in data operation by optimizing the location where data is processed, because you can really make a big difference of avoiding data operations or data transfers that are not needed. Then we have Tango, which is setting up a cross-sector data sharing platform. So it's a very broad project that is looking at many aspects of data sharing between sectors, and in a way it is anticipating what we are addressing in a later topic in Horizon Europe on integration of data lifecycle, where actually these projects are still in grant agreement preparation. They are not running yet, but they will soon start, where we actually required the projects to work with at least 3 different data spaces in order to have a broad basis for this kind of cross-sector data sharing. But Tango is already doing that. That's why I took it as an example. Actually, it often happens that sometimes projects are anticipating what we are calling in later calls, and that's only a positive sign, of course. This is my last slide, just because how reacting to more higher level policies like resilience and crisis management, we all have to react to this. I mentioned the project CREX Data, which is for critical action planning of extreme scale data in different kind of crisis situations. And then what Shimon mentioned as one of the aspects, one of the areas governed by the Data Governance Act, namely to create a new profession, data brokers or data intermediaries. We also have a project that is looking specifically at the data intermediaries and creating a data brokerage service, and what it means in the kind of situation where there are dynamical data pipelines. Now I come to the end of my presentation, and I share you this link, which is to our repository of projects. So this is the place where you can find in one address the current Horizon Europe portfolio, but also the Horizon 2020 legacy projects on data. So a very large part of the portfolio that I presented to you. That's all. I give the control back to Beatrice if there are any questions to me or the other presenters.
Thank you very much. And no, you will not be able to escape questioning. There were some questions for you as well, because your presentation was also quite interesting and touched on quite a few interesting topics. So one first question is, you discussed about the projects that we are funding, but the idea is that we are just seeding change in the world. So the world should also look at what we are doing and move forward on its own. Do you see the world, the technological world, reacting to our projects? Do you see that the positive, the good results that we are achieving in the projects are actually being reproduced outside of them?
Yes, so I can see two aspects in this. So we are investing funds in these projects, but there is also the counterpart that since we are in a partnership setup, we also expect the private sector to invest in this project as well. This was already the case in the previous Big Data Value partnership, the PPP. And in fact, they reached quite an impressive leverage ratio. They exceeded the expectations because we were requesting a leverage factor of 1 to 4. So for €1 invested, EU money invested, we expected them to raise €4 of private sector investment in the domain, same technical domain. And they actually ended up with a leverage factor of 1 to 7 in the end. By the way, this Big Data Value partnership is still alive and kicking, and it's actually very strong. They have reached now complete autonomy from European funding. And now we are in the new partnership. It also had a promising start, has had already a good leverage rate close to the required one, which is 1 to 1, because it's much bigger activity. We are investing in the AI data and robotics partnership 1.3 billion, and we expect another 1.3 billion from the private sector. So that's one indication of how the other side is reacting to our investment. So measuring it in monetary terms, but the thing is that in the setting where we have the luxury of having the European partnership is good, because then you concretely see how the other side contributes. And then, as Gianfranco presented nicely, also around data spaces, there's so much activity going on that we do not fund, like this Data Spaces Business Alliance and the Gaia X activities, Catena X, all kind of that are closely related, that are actually contributing in different ways, in complementary ways to our agenda. So in the end, we could not do without them, actually, because they are bringing constituencies that we maybe cannot reach out to.
Yeah, thank you very much. And a bit of a follow-up on that, since you mentioned the partnerships. How do you work together with the partnership to make sure that the feedback and impact of the projects is actually taken into account when planning the future framework programs?
Okay, so we do this in many ways, many levels. First of all, that the partnership is an ideal vehicle for clustering the projects. So arrange, for example, working groups or topic groups that are run not by the Commission but by the partnership. And it creates so first of all, they have better qualities and resources for doing that. For us, it's always a bit cumbersome, and we don't have the resources to do all the things that it requires, constant regular events, for example. So they can do that much better than we can do. And then there are formal ways, of course, consultation rounds. So when we write work programs, when we write the strategic plan, as we are now doing for the 25-27 era, we consult the partnership. So it's a sort of more formal consultation. We also have partnership board where we meet at higher level with the partnership from time to time at the director level. And then, of course, we have the grassroots level contacts with them on a daily basis, more informal But I think that's then of course each partnership has their reporting obligations. They have to report the private side investment.
Participate in the data space related actions funded by the European Union.
Indeed, I would put this question to Gianfranco.
Yeah,
Give us a better insight.
thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'll give you an example that is quite straightforward. When we organized our first symposium, we did not expect to make to a full house, as simple as that. So this was already March early this year. The Data Space Support Center were only a few months old. Most of the coordinated support action had just started. Some were not even yet granted their funding, and we had a full house at the event. Again, there's so much noise perhaps, or the many association building in this space, but also so much interest. And the CSAs, private sector, public sector are asking for guidance. We feel all the urgency of supporting them. I'm sure this is a promise I share with DJ Connect. We realize how important it is to move fast and to provide the best support possible. Again, just because we see so much demand for guidance on different tools, let's say, available to each of us, supporting action and funding for the Commission, expertise and industry practice from our side. Kimmo, would you like to add to this?
Yeah, this actually highlights something that Shimon was kind of describing, a situation what we face with these data spaces, the chicken and egg problem, that we don't have data, we don't have data providers, we don't have data users, and it's because of many reasons. It's because of they worrying about their their ownership of their trade secrets, what happens, or citizens, what to happen their personal data, and this may depend partly on the absence of the legal framework, which is now coming into place. So now we are at the doorsteps of the adoption of the Data Act, and then it will take some time before it's applicable. Data Governance Act is already applicable, and so the situation is changing rapidly now. So I think in order to win this chicken and egg problem, we have, this is exactly the reason why we have been supporting these data platforms and these pilots or sandboxes, because people need to have concrete environments where they can visualize the problems and the challenges that they will be facing. But this is a common issue that we have also on the projects. I mean, what is expected from the projects, it's not always easy to say that to people who are saying, well, what concrete results did your project give? And then we can mostly say that, well, it will feed into the next phase of the evolution towards common European data spaces. That's not very exciting sometimes. So because people very often they expect visible, tangible gadgets arising from projects. So that's why we sometimes also have to persuade them to release gadgets.
May I suggest a little addition to that? That is, what we have experienced is that use cases make a lot of a difference. So a data space that is abstract, because we have a sort of an intuition that the data is needed, have a good opportunity perhaps to get to market. But a data space that has one or two practical use cases that are the objectives also against which they will be evaluated in their early lives, those are the ones that usually have a much more pragmatic early life. Again, the automotive Catena X data space is a good example. They are working towards a few specific objectives, like the real-time sharing of live information from vehicles, so to detect situations of hazard on the roads as you drive. So if everybody is braking, clearly there's something wrong. All the cars can share that information in real time, and possibly for the ones that are a bit more modern, can suggest the driver to slow down or slow down automatically. That's obvious, right? You may say, why aren't we doing it already? So that's a real use case of how the reason why they're sharing data. They're working on emissions data sharing for assessing the environmental impact of the industry itself. Another very pragmatic application in the light of the obligations they have to report on that also for legislation. So all of these use cases sum up in a way justify even the cost of starting a data space. That, by the way, is not necessarily just about the technology. It's about all of the training you need, the changing of the mentality and culture in your organization. And as we were saying earlier, not feeling threatened by sharing, as long as it is controlled and you can feel sovereign. You have control of the data you are sharing.
Thank you very much. On this, I think we can close this section. Thank you very much, Shimon, Gianfranco, and Kimmo, for being with us today and for the insights you have shared. Thank you very much to you all, the participants. Thanks for joining us. I hope that you found the session as interesting or even more interesting than I did. And please, please, please do not forget to join us as well in the afternoon for our last session of this year's Connected University on artificial intelligence platforms. Have a nice lunch.
Thank you. Bye.